I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This is the next installment of my lecture series in theories of ethnicity and nationalism. This is section 1.6 on page 12 of my notes. The notes are complete. If you want to access the notes, just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download the PDF. Use it to supplement your reading. We are reading from American Ethnicity, the Dynamics and Consequences of Discrimination. Feel free to click the link and purchase the book. With that, let's begin theories of ethnic relations. Alright, so this is section 1.6. Okay, section 1.6. So 6 power and stratification ethnical theories. 6 power and stratification ethnical theories. Okay, the first, stratification theories. A. Stratification theories emphasizes how the process of discrimination produces, basically, an overrepresentation of members of ethnic subpopulation in various social classes. Okay, there's a lot there, so let's break this down. Emphasizes stratification theories. Obviously, we understand what it means to be stratified. Stratification theories emphasize how the process of discrimination. So the first thing that we want to acknowledge is that discrimination is discrimination is procedural. We saw this in, I forget what section this was, maybe 1.4.3, something like that. I talked about the conditional association between procedure and practice. I forget where it was, but I talked specifically about that relationship between the process, the procedure, and the consequence of that procedure, being practice. What happens in the world, our doing, our interactivity, the things that we do, the systems that we build, the social relations that we construct, our ideologies and everything is undeniably a consequence of a process, a procedure. One aspect, one procedural aspect of discrimination, it was, as a matter of fact, it was, I think it was the name of the section was like the institutionalization of discrimination. It was, I think that you can control F it, right? I use PC. So I think that the chapter that this links to that section. The section title, I just popped in my head, was called The Institutionalization of Discrimination, and this is going to bolster that section, that part of whatever section it was that I discussed. Okay, the idea is our social practices are themselves consequences of procedures that we set in place, and one of the procedures is that discrimination, it produces overrepresentation, and it does this as a consequence of a process. It is in the process of overrepresenting subpopulations. We have our main population. That main population within the context of American ethnical classes is American. And then we have subpopulations, and I talked about this. We have the Black American, and the Asian American, and Hispanic American, and Native American, and da-da-da-da-da-da. What we don't have, however, is the white American, because it's understood that the dominant ethnical group subverts or circumvents its ethnical identification, which is wholly consumed by national identification, thus the transition from ethnicity to nationality. You should be thinking at this point, in terms of discrimination, and I don't want to get too far ahead, that national identification in its purest form, then, is only reserved for some people. Now, I'm not going to, I'm purposefully keeping that a bit provocative, but you you can make the sense, right? Why is it that the dominant population identifies themselves nationally and not ethnically? Nationally, not ethnically, nationally? Well, that's a very good question. I'm not going to give answers just yet. So, in terms of stratification, obviously this has to do with stratification. In terms of stratification, then, stratification theories emphasize how the process of discrimination produces overrepresentation, key term there, overrepresentation of members of ethnic subpopulations in various social classes. So that discrimination diversifies targeted communities. The whole point of discrimination is to diversify targeted communities so that we're perpetually in an antithetical relationship with some group. Oh, well, you know, in the 50s it was blacks. Now it's not so much blacks anymore. Now it's Arabs. Now it won't be Arabs for so much anymore. Now it's going to be Hispanic, Mexicans. It won't be them. Now it'll be some other group and so on. So there's a, if you will, plethora of targets to select from. Right? Who's it going to be today? Is it the blacks? Is it the Hispanics? Is it the... Obviously, this is generalizing grossly, but I want to paint a caricature so that you have a cognitive sort of reference. And then later we'll complicate that. So that's the first part. That's 1A. 1B, these stratification theories, emphasis is placed on, and this is important, the mobilization of power in order to control where ethnic groups are placed in the class system. The mobilization of power in order to control where ethnic groups are placed in the class system. Now, as I said before in a previous lecture, if we think about the labor market as such, and we recognize that one aspect of the labor market pertains to, what was it that I said? It was migrant farming. And this aspect of the total labor market, that is the aspect of the labor market defined by migrant farming, has been reserved for the ethnical subpopulation Mexican Hispanic. Well, the idea is, Mexican Hispanic, even American, the idea is the stratification theory, what does it do? It emphasizes, emphasis is placed on the mobilization of power in order to control where, key point, right? To control where ethnic groups are placed in class systems. So, your ethnical subpopulation has been selected to be represented in our elite academic class, if you will. Now, this isn't as clearly defined. Your ethnical subpopulation has been reserved for representation in our high-tech industry. Your ethnical subpopulation has been selected to be represented in our migrant farming labor economic, the pool, and on and on and on and on. The idea is there is a diversification. Anytime there is stratification, obviously by definition, there has to be. It's a priori true. Right? Anytime there is a system of stratification, there is necessarily a ancillary system of diversification. Right? To stratify is to diversify. The more stratified, the more diversified. But this isn't the word diversity in a good sense. Right? This isn't like the sort of cliched business diversity. This is diversity in terms of the overrepresentation of marginalized communities, to be clear, right? So that as stratification theories account for ethnical subpopulations, it's not that the ethnical subpopulations contribute to a more robust diaspora, though that might be the case. Certainly, probably will be the case in some aspects. Stratification theories account for the increasing stratification and overrepresentation of ethnical subpopulations as a condition for the implementation of more excessive use of power, more excessive use of force, more constraining, delimiting socioeconomic conditions in which people are slated for position XYZ. right? And there's a ton of discourse that I can go into with respect to how this manifests, but I don't want to get into too much. There's one aspect that I do want to sort of identify, and I'm going to just keep it simple so that it doesn't become too complex. But you can imagine we have the triangle, and we're going to create a stratification, right? So we've stratified our population. So this would be, and this is sort of a gross generalization, just so that you have a visual image of, okay, taking this theory now, always, I love theory, but theory it's not worth a grain of salt if you don't apply it. And all I'm about is application, right? So granted, this is a very general application, but it will facilitate a more complex understanding on your part. So imagine that this is the totality of totality of national ethnical population. This is the totality of our national ethnical population. And we'll say that, how do I even do this? It's actually a lot, now that the application, I didn't want to take it that far. I didn't want to take it that far. Okay. So imagine that this is, I don't want to take it too far for a number of reasons, but so I'm going to sort of contain what I'm going to say to an extent. I'm going to censor what I'm going to say to an extent. The totality of our national population, and we'll say that the majority of people in the population are, let's say, whites. Right? Then we'll say that the smallest minority are Asians, let's just say, and the sort of middle ground are blacks. Right? So we have, and it's probably better to say Caucasian so I can have ABC. So I will do that, right? Right. So we have Asians as our minority, blacks as sort of in the middle, and Caucasians as our majority. Now, in terms of the population, these are, and this is important, right? Just the dispersion of ethnical categorizations is a statistical fact, right? You just, okay, what do you classify yourself as in terms of race? Oh, you're white, you're black, you're Asian. You're white, you're black, you're Asian. Oh, there's X number of whites, there's X number of blacks, there's X number of Asians. The only aspect of social construction in this endeavor is the identification of race. But once there's a norm established, and there is a norm established, there's been a norm established to identify race, then there's no hocus pocus to this. This is a simple numbers game. You just count. Okay, so we have X number of whites, we got X number of blacks, we got X number of Asians. Simple. In terms of, and this is the interesting part, right? In terms of the total population, this number, the statistical fact, is objective, barring sort of the social construction of race, right? So this is contingent on objective criteria. This is contingent on objective criteria. Now, what you might not recognize is the inversion that takes place, right? Again, huge generalization, but I want to break this down so that it's clear. In terms of not the population, but this concept, and we'll put it in quotes, power, whatever the hell that means, right? So power with the same ethnical population, where the base is less powerful and the apex is more powerful. So this is, we'll say most and least powerful. So there's an increase of power as you go up, there's a decrease of power as you go down. Rather than being at the bottom, C's at the top. Rather than being at the top, A's in the middle, and rather than being in the middle, B's at the bottom. Right? So we have Caucasians as most powerful, Asians as next most powerful, blacks as least powerful. So the idea, and this is the hallmark of just good research, is to ask yourself, what's up with that? What's up with that? Why is it that Caucasians, whites, have the most power? Now, it might be simply, and this is sort of a relatively simplistic argument, is that there's a direct correlation now. Now we're going to do a bona fide correlation, and this is why I wanted to go slow so that you can see it. There might be a direct correlation between what in this, if this is true. Well, there might be a direct correlation between population number, sort of the fact of the amount of numbers, right, between the number, the population, the objective criteria, and the level of power. That might be true, right? Why? Well, that would make sense. If we have the majority of people as whites, and whites have the most power, then you're making the argument that there is a correlation between the amount of representation in the population and its increase in power. And that would look like this. Power, population, and what you're saying is as your population increases, the amount of power that they exercise socially increases. Well, that would be, okay, fine. If there's a direct correlation between, and we started off very, very sort of abstract, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty, but I can test the truth of this assumption. I mean, this might hold true in the United States of America, so let's run the test. Okay, how many whites are there? There are X number. How many blacks are there? There are X number. How many Asians are there? There are X number. Okay, I get it. But while that holds for Caucasians, you will notice that it doesn't hold for blacks. Well, if that were the case, and it seems to be the case for sort of the ruling class, if you will, well, shouldn't blacks still remain in the middle? That undermines the efficacy of this argument. That undermines the efficacy of this argument. So maybe it's not true. But then you think to yourself, you think, well, you know, Mandela, R.I.P., shout out to Mandela, he just died a few days ago, and he came from apartheid South Africa, and it wasn't the case that the ruling class, those who had the most power, were of the most dense population, right? Because the ruling class was in the minority in terms of population density. There weren't many of them. Whites, I think, were 15% of the total population, 10 to 15% of the total population, but had all the power. So what does that mean? That means this is crap. This cannot be true. This assumption, without even looking at the numbers, we've already disproved this assumption. Though it might be the case, might, in italics and quotes and underline, though it might be the case in some instances that there is a correlation between population density of an ethnical group and the amount of power that they exert socially is in a sort of 1-to-1 correlation or 2-to-1 correlation or what have you. Given the case of black representation in the United States and underrepresentation of whites in terms of their population density and overrepresentation in terms of their social ability to mobilize power and execute political power, we realize that power isn't really contingent on population. There's no real correlation per se with respect to political power and the exertion of political power and the representation of those in power in terms of their ethnicity. Ethnically, you can see how we're moving more and more towards national discourse and less towards ethnical discourse. But there isn't really a correlation between the ethnical identification, and listen to this point, right? There isn't really any significance in the ethnical identification of those in political power and their representation for themselves, not for the people, for themselves, in the population. Why? Because power is something power is something different. It's something more complex than just numbers, right? So you'll hear sort of the old cliched, and it's really not cliched, but you'll hear sort of, I'm not sure how many of you saw the remake to Planet of the Apes, and the ape takes one stick and he breaks the stick, and you give him, 2 sticks, it's harder. You give him, 15 sticks, it's impossible to break it, and there's power in numbers and such. That idea that there is power in numbers, the phrase, there is power in numbers, specifically speaks to society. It does not speak to the ruling class. That's absolutely important, right? So that when people evoke there's power in numbers, they immediately telegraph their theoretical basis, the basis for which they are arguing, and you let me know, you let theorists know that you are, which is not bad or good, it's just you're telegraphing your position, you let me know that your theoretical justification is in defense of the people. You're arguing on behalf of the people. Why? Because it's only when you're talking about the people, the mass, society, that is true. It's only when you're talking about the power within social nexus, the mass, and many theorists talk about this, that relation is true. Why is that the case? You can just look at South African apartheid. The ruling class, had all the power and the least amount of numbers. So that the idea that there is power in numbers is actually a delusion. To say that there's power in numbers, it deludes, and I don't necessarily mean it's fake, but it deludes the individual into believing that we falsified this expression to apply totally. It makes it seem there is power in numbers, sort of that adage. It makes it seem that this is, in fact, a fact and not a correlation. Not only is this not a fact, and it is a correlation, it's a very weak correlation. It's a very specific correlation applied to individual national identities. But the truth of the matter is, the establishment of political power, governance, not government, and control is not contingent on population density. The representation of the political establishment within the population, it is absolutely not. Which leads us to ask, what is that force? Unfortunately, I'm sorry to be such a tease, that would take our lecture on a tangent, because it no longer really applies to stratification theories per se, and it goes into power discourse and others, so I'm sorry to be such a tease, but I will have to move on to number 2. So I think that should be very clear now. Okay, so from 1, what we get number 2. What we get from number 1 is that, we have to be careful about what we're saying from a theoretical standpoint. And, I have students tell me this all the time. And I don't think it's a weakness. I think it's a power. But, I'm actively writing. I took a year off from doing this and writing feverishly. 3 books will be coming out eventually after it goes through this incredibly difficult peer review process. Somewhat discouraging peer review process, but I represent a different approach to academic publication because I was trained as a philosopher. I am indebted to philosophical theory, and while I always have to be mindful of the application of my theoretical concepts, I don't like, and I refuse, more so than I don't like, I refuse to have to change my style such that my theoretical writing needs historical contextualization for each instance. I will not conform. I will not conform. I will not write that textbook. Theoretical application is assessed logically, for me, not historically. That's the old hat. That's what my predecessors did. And shout out to all my predecessors. I'm not taking that bit of the baton. I'm going to justify my theoretical claims within logic, sparingly using history when I need it, but the idea that history is the harbinger of all truth is laughable at best, because we know about the influence of power over history. Why do I bring this up? Because of sayings like there's strength in numbers. I cannot tell you how many times I've read that in texts. And I consider myself pretty left, right? Oh, well, you know, power to the people, or there's power in numbers, and power in numbers, power in numbers, power in numbers, power in numbers. And you think about the positionality, the theoretical positionality of the researcher, of the author. And you think to yourself, if we make that assumption, you create a historical disservice to the facts. There's power in numbers? Okay, sure, there's power in numbers. Great. Okay, so are we talking about sort of Romanov overthrow? Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Napoleon? Like, there's power in numbers? Okay, that's great. But just to say that there's power in numbers, it makes it seem as though it was historically accurate. And it's not. You don't even need to go to history to realize that this is a generalization at best, right? There's power in numbers. Yeah, there's power in numbers if you're substantially weak. If you're weak, there's tremendous power in numbers. But the idea that power is itself dependent on numbers is one of the grossest errors of all social scientific research. And theorist after theorist after theorist who justify this claim by appealing to history make it repeatedly. I don't think a month goes by, I read feverishly, I don't think a month goes by, not a month, since I began this journey in '02, that I don't read some, because I read a lot of leftist stuff, right? I don't think a month goes by that I don't read some version of that concept. There's power in numbers in a text, right? Oh, we are underrepresented, and if we mobilize ourselves, that's mobilization presupposes power in numbers. If we mobilize ourselves, then that process of mobilization will get us to political representation, and that political representation will then affect policy, and that policy will then manifest itself in equity socially. Wow, that's really great. I get it. Yeah, I've heard that 1,000 times. Okay, say something that I don't know. Why? Because you are still in a position of asking for representation. You are still in a position to be determined, your fate, to be determined by those who have power, whoever they might be, those who have power. And this idea that it's specifically because you have numbers that you have, no, it's not, that's not true. That's South Africa, what just happened, I mean, not just happened, but with respect to Mandela. South Africa is a perfect example. The relationship of power distribution in the United States is a perfect example. It's not the case. There's something much deeper to this assertion that there's power in numbers, which is precisely why, and I'll get back on track after this, which is precisely why those theorists, and there is a need to have theorists, let's keep it funky, those theorists who presuppose that you're not doing good theory unless you make historical appeal, I just proved why that's problematic, right? Why I'm not doing that, why if they're not going to publish my stuff because I'm not making historical appeals, well, don't publish my stuff. I'm not going to lose no sleep. You know what I'm saying? I'm really not. It's a bit of a pet peeve for me, right? The idea of power numbers is a bit of a pet peeve because it's so cliched now, it's lost any meaning. No one's critically assessing, critically analyzing how that presumption further increases the stratification and the overrepresentation of ethnical subordination by just the appeal to there's power in numbers, right? So yeah, let's diversify it more. Let's stratify it more. If I was in power, and this is why I didn't want to get here. I told myself not to get here, and now I'm freaking here. Jason! I'm not going to say it. Anyway, I'm not going to say it, so I'm sorry. I try to temper myself because I know where all of this goes, and Jason, you know, so I'm not going to say it. You'll have to draw the conclusions yourself. But your appeal to history is you're appealing to a system of power that was established for you to appeal to a system of power. So the fact that you call yourself a liberal and you don't recognize that sometimes you ought not to make historical appeals and that you ought only to appeal to sound logic means that you are deluded by grandeurs of power. And I have no such delusions, right? I recognize the operational function. and I recognize that this is probably abstract and most of you won't get it, and I apologize. But the idea is the stratification theory is huge. It really means something in terms of ethnicity and diversity. It really means something in terms of political power, for good and for bad, depending on what you believe good and bad is. I mean, the more you do this, the grayer it gets. But for the good of society, I'll stop my discussion there. All right, so caste theories. So caste theories, and we all know what the caste system is. It's a version, if you will, of stratification theory. It is applicable, irrespective of where it's applied, to the hierarchical ranking of any number of social factors, demographic identifiers within the society. It could be intellect, it could be religion, it could be ethnical, national, more ethnical, biological kinship. It can be any number of factors. It can be skin color, it can be any number of factors, but it's a ranking, right? Hierarchical ranking. So the 4 general conditions for caste theories. So the first is confinement, right? Confinement is important to lower socioeconomic positions, right? So, for example, an untouchable would be confined to, right? An untouchable would be confined to the lowest class, caste, right? And this is just an example. What does that mean? Well, it means that there has been, for whatever justification, and I'm not trying to go into the justifications for this. This is just the theoretical structure of this system, because it is a system. It's a process as well of isolating and selecting particular demographic identifiers, aspects of social demography, for exclusion from those benefits of those in the highest caste. So it might be that you, the individual, does not have a particular religious affiliation, or the individual doesn't have a particular skin color, especially if we're talking about colonialized world, right? The lighter the shade of color, the more mulatto, the more privilege. The more black, the less privilege. I mean, that sort of is, unfortunately, the standard bearer throughout the globalized world, right? It's hard to find an exception, if you can even find an exception, to sort of the use of colorism. But this idea of confinement is important. Why? Because what confinement does, it quarantines, if you will, right? And that idea of confining, that idea of quarantining, evokes the purity argument, right? That there is some sense in which members of this targeted or identified population could otherwise soil or dirty or contaminate those of a better social position. And they need to be confined. They need to be quarantined as a means of the preservation of some benefits that those who've been selected, those who've been chosen, can protect themselves from. But this idea of confinement becomes problematic. There's tons of stuff to be discussing that. I don't want to get too much deeper into that. That should be clear. Number 2, the denial of access to power. Not only, I mean, if you think about it, right? If you're being confined, you're limited. That limitation requires, actually, I'm writing about ideological stuff. I have to think about that. I should make a note to myself, actually. Hold on a second. That's a really good point. The condition of confining creates and necessitates a limitation of access. That limitation of access via Louis Althusser is going to require structures of control and power and violence to ensure that access is reserved for those who have been selected. Right? You can even use a bit of Marx here, but I would go with Althusser, right? And the idea is that exclusion from access itself, specifically the exclusion from access itself, requires, and also Fanon would be good here as well, in his discourse on the French colonization of Algeria, it requires violence. You can't do that without violence. There at least has to be the threat of violence. Right, so that violence, I mean, also Mandela. I mean, oh my goodness, now all the examples are, yeah, it's absolutely right. Which is precisely why you don't need a lot of people you don't need representation in the mass in order to be in control of power. I mean, you sort of just proved it, right? Ooh, funky, now that I think about it, right? So, calming all of that down, not going much further, the idea of, or even the intent rather, to limit access to power necessitates an apparatus of violence, right? That sort of language is contingent on other theorists. You might not know this. I know this, and maybe some more astute viewers will pick up on these references. But the limitation of access to opportunity and access to power itself requires apparati of violence, which operationalize violence, and that's critically important. Another, obviously, is the denial of intermarriages. We saw that marital assimilation was one of the forms of assimilation. Just to evoke assimilation is sort of homogenizing. Assimilation is far more complex, far more intricate than just sort of looking like or being like or culturally assuming the characteristics of the dominant culture. We recognize there was symbolic and symbols, that we recognize that there was intermarriage. And the denial to intermarry means that you are denying access to the national identity, right? Why? Because if in the case of, and this is specifically the case in the United States of America, for the majority of our identity, the majority of American identity has been built on this. It's only recently, maybe the last 50-ish years, that things have changed. I mean, this is really, relatively speaking, if you think about the nation, the concept of a nation, and I'm nudging a little bit more towards that sort of national identity. It's very, very new concept in in our United States of America national identity. Why? Because I do have hope in that regard. I hate the freaking term hope. I loathe it. But I do have hope. I really do have hope. I would say I have belief in the inferential. I have belief based on past historical criteria that my inference will be correct. I'd rather say that than hope. That eventually, at least theoretically, national identification will be more inclusive and less exclusive. Because it's exclusively now for white people in the United States of America. As a fact, there is no white American. That means something, right? There's almost always an ethnical qualification of any other group, barring whites, in America. The fact that we're having this very nuanced theoretical argument, however, I think is progress. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of African American scholars that will disagree with me, and vehemently so, fine, no problem. But that is progress, because it used to be the case that you couldn't marry at all, period. That was just recently the case, in my mom's lifetime. It wasn't possible. Now we're having arguments, sociolinguistic arguments, right? I think having a sociolinguistic argument rather than a policy argument is progress. Having a sociolinguistic argument rather than having a biological argument, as if there were some biological truth to the contamination of interracial marriage, is absolutely a demonstration of progress. 50 years from now, we'll look back at this and say, we're no longer even having that sociolinguistic argument. We've reconciled that sociolinguistic problem. It was relatively not that hard. I don't have hope or faith in that. I can draw the inference based on sort of repetition, right? I've seen historical progress. Now, I'm not trying to blow the American horn and be Mr. Patriot here, but there has been progress, and that's undeniable as a fact. Whether or not you like U.S. or not, the United States of America has become more inclusive and is continuing to be more inclusive as a historical fact. Now I'm going to make my historical appeals. I only make my historical appeals when it suits my position. But But it's true as a historical as a historical fact. Okay, moving on. So politically, that was so evil. Politically enforced segregation obviously is one way of reinforcing caste systems, and that's, I mean, that's sort of obvious. I don't need to sort of discuss that. That's sort of like that by definition. So I think we get the caste theory. That should be clear. All right, number 3. Colonialism theories. So, wow, number 3 is actually pretty long. So colonialist theories, very, very complex. To sort of just set the conceptual landscape really quickly, you have the colony, right? Or you have the motherland or fatherland. So you have the colony, or we'll say potential colony, and we go to the colony, we extract all of the booty, and we generate capital, right? So this is sort of capital, sort of the basis of, I mean, capitalism is built on this, and this goes back. This is before people will say, "Oh, it's the British Empire and British imperialism." It's absolutely false. It begins with really Alexander the Great and his conquests. He's the first globalizer. He wanted to globalize his culture. He wanted to nationalize his nation. He sought to construct systems that would effectively increase both the political control and power, but also increase the economic resources and economic accessibility to resources of the empire. But this is the system 101. So we have the mother or fatherland, we have the potential colony, we send out any number of people, we send out our missionaries, we send out our explorers, and we send out our colonizers, and they do that. So the act of colonizing, and this is sort of like 101, but it's important to understand this. The act of colonizing, right? Sort of colonizing as sort of a concept. It's colonizing, I think, is a nice soft term. Fanon would roll in his grave by the use of the term colonizing. But the act of colonizing is, as I said before, it is impossible to do this via persuasion. The act of colonizing necessitates, and there's tons of theoretical justification for this, and there's tons of historical examples for this, the act of colonizing necessitates apparatus of violence. It necessitates. So before the first ship leaves the motherland, the fatherland, the act of colonizing, which is the goal, is to colonize these people, those people, necessitates apparatus of violence. So you better believe on that ship, right next to the missionaries and the welders, well, not the welders, the builders and the craftsmen and the artisans, are going to be, the strong arm, are going to be the bullies, going to be the gangsters, right? Going to be the heavy hand to make sure that they stay in line. Now, this is more complex than just physical violence. It also includes intellectual dominance, which is something that I'm not going to talk about now because it's not appropriate to talk about it. So let's just talk about sort of the physical violence. Get to the colony, institute the act of colonizing or colonization, which is a process. The act of colonizing or colonization ends in the colony. So that colonization, C-O-L-O-N-I, colonization, is a means to the colony. You cannot have colonized, past tense, and thus claimed a colony without the process of colonization. You cannot have gone through the process of colonization without establishing apparatus of violence. Thus, you cannot attain a colony without violence, as a fact. Now, in terms of the end result, the colony creates a condition, and I'm really going sort of deep into this, but it's important that you understand this, because none of this is going to make sense if I don't explain it. The colony creates a mentality. It creates, and this part is far more sort of esoteric. There's a few of us that do this bit and that get it, so I'm not going to go too deep in this, but the colony, the end result, creates a mindset. Fanon talks about this a lot, right? And many others, many people talk about it. It creates a colonial mind. So you can imagine that the colony now creates sort of the colonial mind. Now, this idea of mind, I don't like the term mind. I'm sort of theoretically averse to the word mind. I don't mean immaterial Cartesian mind. And I also don't mean mind as what I believe the mind is, a biological phenomenon of our interneural wiring. I don't mean that either. I mean mind in terms of a modality of interpreting the world. That's what I mean by mind, to clarify, right? So I don't mean Cartesian mind because I don't believe in a Cartesian mind. I don't mean mind in sort of biologically what I believe in, the mind as a biological thing. I don't mean that either. Mind is a euphemism for the modality in which individuals interpret and make sense of their world, right? It's an interpretational means of attaining knowledge. So mind in that sense. The colonial mind is such that those who have been colonized think to facilitate their own oppression. So Fanon says, the colonized mind, once it's been colonized, I think this is Fanon that says this, it could be Du Bois, it could be, I don't know, I've read so many theorists. If there is no back door, the colonized individual, marginalized member of the colony, the person who's being colonized, mentally will create a back door for him or herself. If there is no back door, I know I'm not supposed to come through the front, so I will, of my own volition, create a condition for my own subjugation. I've been conformed, I've been colonized. So the colonized mentality is that. One last bit, and then I'll get into this, because I think it's absolutely clear now. To be post-colonial, is not geographic. It has no geographical reference at all. Post-colonialism is not a thing. Colonization is a thing. It exists in the world. It's empirically true. It's empirically real. To create a colony through the process of colonization is real. There were laws. There were people. There were bullets. There were guns. There were knives. There were killings. There were that. It's real. It exists in the world. The mind that's created, the colonized mind, is an affect. Psychologists might say it is a trauma experienced as a process of colonization. That is real. The colonized, quote-unquote, mind is real. It's traumatic, is real. Post-colonialism is a critique of the colonized trauma, the colonized mentality. It's a, hey, wake up. Don't you see that you just created a new... Post-colonialism it's shock therapy, if you will. Wake up, man. Like, don't you see you're creating your own back door? So post-colonial theory and post-colonialism is a response to the willful adoption of colonized mentalities in those who have been colonized. It's an address to those who have assumed a position of intellectual subordination. And that's the intellectual violence, right? The intellectual violence is the ability to create systems of control so powerful that the individual, even if you tell them, cannot forfeit that. And it's terribly evil. Now, you put evil in scare quotes, right? Because, you know, it all depends on what team you're batting for. But, and I'll just end on this note, and then I'll get back to this, because it's very important. Colonial theory is hugely important in terms of race theory. You can't, I don't believe you can do race theory, you can't do critical race theory, you can't do any of this, you can't do ethnicity if you're not steeped in colonial theory and post-colonial theory. So it's important, it's absolutely essential that you understand this. Otherwise, this is a waste of freaking time. it's important. So one last bit, and then I'll sort of get back to the notes. And I knew I was going to go off on this. It's not a tangent. I was going to go off on this sort of expedition, if you will. The individual, in terms of abuse, domestic abuse, child abuse, what have you, it's one thing to experience the physical trauma. It's one thing to experience the rape. It's one thing to experience the beating. It's one thing to experience the physical violence. But in time, if freed from that physical violence, we heal. And we will remember the trauma, but you can't recollect the pain. You can account for it, yeah, it was painful, da, 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 but the pain has subsided, it's past. And intellectual violence, for someone to say something to you, like, you're never going to amount to shit, you're no good, you're ugly, you're fat, you're lazy, you're weak, you're stupid, that shit stays for your life. That shit stays for your life. It's not to say that, you know, intellectual violence is better or worse than physical violence. It's just that I don't think people recognize how traumatic that can be. And that's the baby surface stuff. That doesn't even really count, right? But we all, to some extent, have experienced trauma in our lives as a condition of what was said. Imagine the trauma, mentally, experience of having lived through colonization and the effects of colonization. The one grain of hope, well, there I'll say it, that I've seen recently, and I'll return to this, is, you know, I didn't know anything about Nelson Mandela at all. I mean, I knew I'm an academic. I knew what he did. I knew what he stood for. But recently, you know, there's been a lot of stuff on him, so I'm watching the videos and, you know, learning more about what I've seen. You know, if I read it in text, it has significance. Watching the videos, seeing his life story. It's refreshing to know that you can experience that level of colonized trauma and still turn out to be such a freaking awesome person. Because my inclination might be to hack and slash and burn and revenge. But there is hope for a better alternative, right? So I think this next wave, we've sort of moved from post-colonial theory. I've moved from post-colonial theory. I think this next wave of discourse on colonization should assume, shout out to Fanon, and shout out to the idea of, oh, reciprocal violence. Oh, you're going to hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back. You're going to oppress me, I'm going to try and put you in a position of fear. I'm not sort of characterizing Fanon, right? But we all know Fanon. Mandela's vibe was cool. I like that. I think that, I'm not going to write the text, I can tell you that right now. But I think someone should write the text. I think someone should look at an epistemic means of coping and responding to colonized violence with sort of a renewed discourse on nonviolence and nonviolent approaches. It has theoretical significance. I'm just not the guy to write that text, right? So that's the intro to number 3, and now we can begin. Number 3. So colonialism theories. The first is that of external colonialism, right? So external. External colonialism, the process by which one nation controls the political and economic activities of another, less developed and less powerful society. So that's what I drew. The motherland sending out its fleet to some unknown territory for the purpose of collecting the goods, increasing the scope of the empire, increasing the political power of the empire and such, right? So external colonialism is what I just described. In terms of external colonialism, however, we can take what I just described and further. I don't want to use deconstruction in the Derridian sense. I'm just using it as, rather than saying breaking down. But we can deconstruct, not in the Derridian sense. We can analyze meticulously those aspects of external colonialism. So let's look at the 4 elements, right? So first, there's a forced entry into a territory and its population, obviously, right? There's a forced entry into a territory and its population. Hi, We're the colonizers. We have some rules. Take us to your leader. Number 2, alteration or destruction of the indigenous culture. This is the fourth world. So we know there's a first world, we know there's a third world. The fourth world is the indigenous population, right? So with reference to indigenous peoples, with reference to indigenous populations, we use, for right or wrong, the phrase fourth world. So alteration or destruction of the indigenous culture, that is the fourth world culture, and patterns of social organization. We realize that the social organization of the community in which colonizers are now occupying must be conducive to the needs of the colonizers, not the needs of the inhabitants. Very complex, right? But also very simple. It's sort of philosophical in that sense, right? Obviously, the social organizations that you have already existing in no sense is going to benefit me, so why in the world would I want to keep your social organizations? No. Your social organizations are no longer important. We are going to assume the control of your social organizations via the incorporation of your leaders into our hierarchical system. Your leaders will inherently be bequeathed the greatest position of power that any colonized group can have. Why? Because why are we going to reinvent the wheel? You already have a system of hierarchical social organization where your leaders are at the top. We're just going to basically co-opt your leaders into our new social organization and transform the old, your original indigenous system with the new, our system, right? And you can see that it's horrible to talk about it in this way, but this is a very effective, it had been a very effective way of globalizing control. It's the worst thing you can do now because of post-colonial theory, because of movements like the Algerian Rebellion, like any number of rebellions, because of Fanon, because of social theorists, because people are not going to give up their traditional ways of life for the expanse of global capitalism without a fight. The idea is that global capitalism doesn't need really to do that in order to spread its wings. So what we've seen in recent years, and why I'm encouraged for a brighter prospect, is that no, we can have a more discursive approach. It doesn't have to be so top-down. It doesn't have to be so heavy. Why? Because that heavy-handedness undermines power. And I'm not going to go into the infinite number of examples, but if you think about just regular oil production anywhere in any given territory, if oil production is going to displace huge segments of indigenous communities, those indigenous communities, once they recognize that there really is nowhere left for them to go, are going to be forced, because of external social conditions, to undermine the integrity of any number of oil rigs or refineries or what have you. And that does the company bad, right? That undermines their bottom line. It undermines their interest. They spend all this overhead and all this money, where if we could understand their social systems, if we could understand how they function by doing some ethnography before we go build, well, maybe we can find a way in which people can be compensated so that we both can thrive. We can make a crap ton of money. They can have their peaceful life. Everybody's kumbaya. I mean, I don't believe in kumbaya, but it's a better alternative than sending the mercenaries and wipe them out. Why? Because eventually sending the mercenaries and wipe them out just doesn't work. It just does not work in the long run. It has been proven not to work in the long run. If you don't believe me, look at the British Empire. Shout out to the Brits. You know I got love for you, but it was a little too heavy-handed. It was too heavy-handed, and the United States of America had better take note, right? Because if we assume this heavy-handedness in terms of our political affairs, Britain's no longer the dominant global power. And I can tell you one thing that I know for certain is America is trying to keep that power as long as it possibly can. And the idea is we have to be empathetic to the plight of fourth world indigenous populations if any of this is going to survive. If it's, we have the power to wreck and burn, and thus we wreck and burn everything, and we don't have to consolidate or incorporate people's diversity in our underlying business model or political agenda, well, I can guarantee you we won't be on top for long, because the world will not accommodate that. So it's terribly important in terms of external control, in terms of external colonialism, external control. The destruction of indigenous populations is really problematic. So I didn't write 1 and 2 down, but that's important. Number 3, domination of the indigenous population by representatives of the invading society. I just explained that. Number 4, justification of such activities with highly prejudicial racial beliefs and stereotypes, right? You need to justify this. You need to create a system which will entitle the colonizers to be able to sleep at night. Did you see what you just did today? Think about the colonization of former Rhodesia. Think about the Congo. Think about the brutality of colonization. Right? Sure, Rhodes scholarships are great. You know, it's a very prestigious award, but the means with which it was colonized, I don't care how mighty the king thought he was, Leopold thought he was. I mean, it was absolutely brutal. Kids being killed, routine, habitualized mutilations, amputations. As a system of control, it's completely exploitative. There's no room for that in the 21st century. There is no room for that in the 21st century on any level. So that the idea is that physical dominance and physical violence as a means of establishing control, as a means of perpetuating and expanding national interests, you can see we're really getting to the national level now, needs to account for other mechanisms rather than just, for good or for bad, rather than just, I have machetes and guns, right? That's just not going to work, right? But the way that you do that, the way that you incentivize your killers, the way that you incentivize your henchmen, is you tell them a story. You tell them a story that they are on the good team and these are the bad people. You tell them a story of, no offense to people's religious beliefs, you tell them a story that they were, you know, incentivized or justified by God or what have you, right? Again, no disrespect to people's religious beliefs, but this is the fact. This is the fact. Oh, you were ordained by God to do all this killing. Go kill everybody. And I mean, that becomes problematic, right? That becomes problematic for social relations. So that was number 4. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause at this point before I go to 3B, and then I will continue to make sure that I can get all of this done. This is a pretty substantial amount of work here. So I'm going to pause at 3 and then pick up with 3B. Okay, so to continue now 3B. Internal colonialism, right? So we talked about the conditions for external, now we're going to look at internal. When we talk about colonialism, people make the false assumption that colonialism is inherently external. So all of colonialist discourse, not all, a significant portion of colonial discourse is concerned with external colonialism. It's what first comes to mind. But the idea is colonialist practices, in fact, were more insidious than just external colonialism. To think that it could possibly be more insidious is probably the most vile recognition of all, barring genocide. But the idea is, no, it wasn't just that this system of dominance and subjugation was exported. We kept it and bred it at home as well. So the idea is, let's look at internal colonialism. First bit. So first aspect of this, number 1, quote, and this is the bottom of page 12, in order to create internal colonies, governments must actively participate. It must provide the coercive force needed to control those who are colonized, while legitimating patterns of domination with law. So, in order to create internal colonies, right, internal colonies, governments must actively participate. It must provide the coercive force needed to control those who are colonized while legitimating patterns of domination with law. So the idea of internal colonization, I didn't say this at the time, but this is a few lectures ago, but internal colonization is one aspect, there's many, one theoretical application of stratification theory. Right, so stratification theory, I didn't give you examples of stratification theory when I discussed it earlier in the lecture series, but just look to your notes, look to my notes, find out where I discussed that. One aspect of a stratification theory is the means of internal colonialism. Internal colonialism stratifies its society, right? And the stratification of society is contingent on any number of things. It's contingent on intellectual influence, the ability for intellectual class to create products for consumption, or the intellectual class to create structures and systems of control. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but that's basically what it is, right? So the intellectual class to be able to create, engineer products for consumption or create systems of control. It's also in part these internal colonization. The brutality isn't as brutal. It's not as physical. It couldn't be because you would undermine political power. So internally, with respect to intra-state, it can't be as physically violent as it is when it manifests itself abroad. When it manifests itself abroad, you get to see the real nature of the apparatus of violence because it's heavy intellectual, heavy physical violence on members of the indigenous population. At home, within the colony, within the motherland or the fatherland, intercolonially, it's about power. It's about money. It's about me and mine having economic advantage over you and yours. Me and mine having intellectual advantage over you and yours. So systems are created in order to preserve the intellectual, economic, and political advantages of not just individuals, but families, dynasties, if you will, so that is preserved. In and of itself, sort of the preservation of power and capital and knowledge, in and of itself, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not. I'm an academic. I would be thrilled if my kids, became academics. I would be equally thrilled if they went off and made a crap ton of money. And, I'm working on establishing a name for myself. Not that I'm looking for fame, because God knows I'm not, but I want to be known as a serious academic, a contributor to global learning. And if my kids saw that and were like, hey, I want to pick up the baton and, emulate that and do good in the world, wow, that's great. If your parents happen to be billionaires and you're born into a billionaire fortune and they do good stuff with the billions and you want to chase money and do good stuff with the billions, hey, no problem. It's not a problem. It becomes problematic when the systems are of power and control, and I did this in an Occupy series, I forget where it was, one of the Occupy protest videos that I put up, sounds weird, that I sort of uploaded into the marketplace of ideas, pertain to economic sadism, right? Intellectual sadism, right? If I sit down and construct an ideological system like National Socialist Party did, and I refine it for the extermination of people, and it's because of my thoughts, which is true. People who don't think theory is powerful don't know how powerful theory is, right? And I refine it, and it's operationalized, and 13 million people are slaughtered because of it. No, that's problematic, right? If it's the case that I use my wealth in order not just to take care of my family and others, but I use my wealth for the end of destroying other people's lives and destroying their habitats and destroying their economies, and for that sake, in and of itself, really despotic, really really sort of sadistic, that's problematic. So it's about that domination, right? And that domination can take any number of forms. It's not always about physical domination. There is an economic domination. There is an intellectual domination. There are varying degrees of economic domination and intellectual domination. There might be some good elements, there might be some bad elements, but the idea is to recognize how its use subordinate members of the population, not outside, external to the colony, but within the mother or fatherland, and that becomes problematic, right? So, let me see. Okay, so next I put 4 components of internal colonialization complex, the internal colonialization complex, and I only put, and I only put 3. I have to change that. I have to change that to 3. I might have had 4 and forgot what the 4th one is, so I need to change that on page 13 to 3. It should say 3 components of the internal colonialization complex. So the first is descendants are bequeathed. This is perfect, right? What I was saying, this sort of substantiate what I just said. Descendants are bequeathed power and control via prefabricated unjust social relations and organizations. My kids have an unfair advantage because of conditions X, Y, Z. It's not just that they have an unfair advantage, because I will not defend the position that you're a multi-billionaire and you have billions of dollars and you bequeath this money to your kids and your kids have billions of dollars, and then that's unfair. No, I'm not into the 100% death tax. I don't believe in that at all. It's when you have that money, and I'm just using the money because it's prominent in the United States. People don't really see how the intellect, sort of bequeathing intellectual dominance, is real. It is. But it's something that I won't discuss publicly. The idea is, so money is easy to talk about. So in terms of money, yeah, I mean, it's not that. It's that there's an agenda. It's that there's an underlying hidden intent. And that I'm going to, as dad, if you will, indoctrinate my kids to believe what I believe so that they use this money the way I was using this money and the way that granddad was using this money, which is for domination and control. That starts to sound really conspiracy theory, right? That's a bit of a stretch. The idea is, on a more practical basis, that people do use their position, their intellect, and their money to advance their own agendas and suppress the desires and objectives of others. And that's internally, that's systemically subjugating. It is. Do I believe that there's ever a scenario in which this will stop? Definitely not. I think it's likely that external colonization will come to an end relatively soon, sort of historically speaking. There won't be much more to conquer. And I think what will end up happening is it will be more and more systems of internal regulation and control, for good or for bad. It depends on what side of the fence you sit on. I'm a firm believer that it's the way in which we interpret phenomena that influence sort of anxiety or levels of epistemic accessibility to more knowledge. So I think a lot of that is open for debate. I don't particularly want to go there now. But we recognize that the ability to bequeath fortune, wealth, power, knowledge, position, title is possibly disadvantageous. There's some argument there. There are aspects in which it's clearly malicious and disadvantageous, but I wouldn't, I don't particularly agree with the author 100% on some of these points. Number 2, cheap labor for increased profits, serfdom, slavery, etc. Right? I mean, if you think about indentured servitude, it's internal, right? It's exactly the same thing. You're never going to get enough money in order to flourish. You will only ever have enough money in order to sustain. You will forever be indebted to the landlord, and as such, you're never really going to become an owner. There are mechanisms in place, horrible mechanisms in place. We've done this to blacks, whites, and you name it. The American tradition is built on this, right? The idea is we are moving, this is why I'm hopeful. I've seen the inference that we are becoming more and more inclusive, but also we are becoming more and more, we are allowing ownership. We are allowing for the procurement of wealth. There's more opportunity now for access to almost limitless capital. I mean, capital is by definition limitless, but there's more accessibility now than there has ever been. It's not to say it's the greatest time in the world. It's not to say that there aren't injustices, but you know a little programming code, you got a cool idea, you can throw something up that's half-baked, and you can sit high on the fat economic horse. And now, if that's what you're interested in, chasing money, which I don't think is a bad thing, then now is a better time than ever. But the idea is of recognition that that accessibility, right, that accessibility itself, that entrepreneurial tendency within this sort of this new millennial group, wouldn't even be possible were it not for a previous era where the reigning paradigm for capital was exploitation and cheap labor, right? It's fortunately the case that that paradigm is shifting, and it's not as it used to be. But the truth of the matter is, that's an advantage that is very recent in the last, within the turn of the century, right? Before that, there wasn't a mechanism. The internet didn't exist. There wasn't a mechanism in which we could procure great profits and minimize costs outside of cheaper slave labor. Now there is. So you better believe that the trend's going to be more and more internet sensitive, internet heavy, internet dependent. So I do believe, while number two is true, cheap labor, this is changing somewhat, right? Now, granted, I also recognize that I'm giving this lecture in the worst economic environment since the Great Depression. I think it's still true that the recession technically ended in 2009, maybe 10, but you can ask anybody, John Jay, Jane Doe on the street, what it feels like in America, and it's still economically, very economically, the environment is not promising. I'm not a politician, so I don't have to, sell the PR that, everything's great. It really isn't. All right, number three, territorial domination and control. This is staple. This is absolutely staple. An instance where national identity is inherently antithetical to previous ethnical land ownership occupation. So you can imagine that there are, in terms of external, right? External communities, external colonization, the practices of dominating their land is exactly how we acquired this land. Think about that, right? The practices of external colonialism is exactly the same that informs internal colonialism. Why? Because this land, for example, any land, all nations, but I'm using the United States as an example, United States was not our land to begin with. It was Native American land. What did we do? We basically colonized this land via external colonization. We acquired this land. Now it's American land. The same practices that we used to acquire the land, since it proved effective enough to build up United States to this point, it increases the tendency, I don't say it necessitates, but it increases the tendency that those same practices are going to be used. The problem is, however, if those same practices are used internally, and we seek to sort of export American imperialism, right? Globally, we can look at what happened with the British Empire within the last century as an indication of where that will take us. There will be a usurper. So we can't do what the Brits did. We have to do something different. One key element, not to defame the Brits at all, got tons of love for them, but as a fact, one key element to the British collapse of global power was the over-investment in colonization, was the perpetual cost of sustaining that level of brutality and violence, because colonization is not possible without violence. So the perpetual war. that perpetual economic it was a bottom line argument. It wasn't because of humanity and all that, and the United States of America was more ethical than Brits, and it wasn't that at all. It was that the British Empire fell because it overinvested itself in perpetual war. Colonization is impossible without violence. Violence requires money. Thus, perpetual colonization requires perpetual money, and the Brits bankrupted themselves. We, the great usurpers, came in and took the mantle of control. And you better believe that if we are perpetually invested in war, if we are perpetually invested in conflict, and we're not thinking more nuanced, more negotiation, more co-creatively, that we too will eventually hit the bottom line, and money, at the end of the day, capital will find a new leader. Because capital isn't connected to any nationality, you better believe it. So that's that bit. So territorial domination and control, and obviously we see that the end result of that, despite the fact that there are going to be short-term gains, in the long term, it's unsustainable. It's just, you look at any empire, it's unsustainable. If your national identity, and now we're really getting heavy into the national bit, but if your national identity is defined by territorial expansionism and global domination, you will eventually bankrupt yourself, and someone will assume the mantle of power. You cannot possibly sustain a meaningful national superpower, if you will, status at that level of global systemic violence. It's just unsustainable. And, for those nations that don't believe it, it's a gamble playing that game, because there is no second place. There really isn't. It's all or nothing. So, number 2, logic. Nations need land. Ethnical groups own land, to the exclusion of other ethnical groups. Nations seize control of land with force, obviously, relocate land for its citizens, which is broader than any ethnical group, or it reserves land for only dominant ethnical groups. Both are problematic, but the latter more problematic. Why? The nation expands, and as the nation expands, as the worlds become colonized, you're going to eventually, after the colonizers complete their mission of colonizing, and the process of colonization ends in a colony, well, then you're going to have migration of citizens to the colonized world, this newly colonized world. Hey, it's like Little Britain. So let's just go to India. Let's pack up and move to India. I mean, we're in control. There's systems there. There's great economic advantage there. There's room for growth there. Let's go. So you get a ton of Brits leaving England, encouraged to leave England, to go and establish roots, real roots, for themselves and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grands in this new world. And they do that. So that part of, if you think about that, however, part of the process of colonization presupposes that the resources of the colonized world will be reserved for those back home who want it. So if you want it, come and get it. That's the idea. If you want, sort of like to break it down colloquially. If you want it, come and get it. Now, so it's a free-for-all, so people leave. Now imagine, however, that we have completed this process of colonization, but the benefits, the access to resources, have been reserved for only those segments of our society that have this particular ethnical type. Well, what are you saying? What you're saying then is inter-colonial, within our society, it's only those segments of our particular society that the benefits of colonization have been reserved for. And what do you think that's going to create? Well, obviously it's going to create tensions, intra-state tensions. And those tensions are going to be inter-ethnical. So you're going to have intra-state, inter-ethnical, it looks like this, state, ethnicity. So this is inter, this is intra. So intrastate, inter-ethnical conflict, right? That's what's going to end up happening. Why? Because of the the fighting, the feuding over economic resources of a colonized world. What ends up happening to the colonized world? They become subaltern. Right? No one's talking about them because everybody's talking about the state and the fighting, the infighting within the state. No one's talking about what happened to the colony, and this is where amazing social theorist Gayatri Spivak, S-P-I-V-A-K, this is where Spivak, her discourse reigns supreme, because we still have a colony, and no one's concerning themselves with the colony at all. It doesn't matter. We're talking about us, right? Well, they have this, and they're getting access to that, and da-da-da-da. And the question is, what happened to the colony? The colony has been subaltern. They're no longer relevant. They no longer have a voice. They're no longer being considered in any regard. So that's the end of number 3. Okay, so again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause at this point, and then, because I'm at the halfway point, which is crazy. I'm at the halfway point, so what section is this? This is complete madness, 1.6. I'm going to pause at this point, transfer some of this video, and then come back and wrap up, probably in another hour, discussion, points 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so we're at number 4, split labor market theories. So let me erase number 3. Alright, so number 4, split labor market theories. Okay, so the first element of split labor market theories is that it's based in ethnical economic competition. So that we already recognize that a capitalist labor market is going to presuppose competition. So competition is essential. That's sort of inescapable. The particular type of competition, however, in this split labor market theory, and I alluded to this earlier, I didn't recognize that I would be discussing it in this much detail now, but I've already alluded to this earlier in relationship to the reservation of particular niche markets, labor markets, and job criteria, for example, migrant farming for Mexican Americans or Mexican workers, is already a reservation of one aspect of the labor market as associated ethnically to other group members. So it's based on ethnical competition. Based on ethnical comp. 2, split labor market theories operationalize power through ethnical antagonism. So that we recognize that power can be operationalized through ethnical antagonism. And the question is how and why. Now, this isn't to say that this is an effective means of operationalizing power. It's not a moral claim. It's not whether this is a good means of or a just means. It's just an occurrence. It's just a phenomenon that occurs. So that you'll have ethnical group A versus ethnical group B. Their relationship will be antagonistic. And the question is how, I should have dropped this a little lower. The question is how, so let me erase the top. The question is how does their antagonism influence power? Well, you can imagine that ethnical group C creates a system of control. Right? The control of the ethnical conflicts between members of Group A and Group B, the institutional control, the apparatus of control of these ethnical subpopulations constitutes and legitimizes to some extent those mechanisms of control. Why? Because the argument, and it should be easy to see this, the argument is if we were to remove these institutions of control, everybody else would be in trouble. Now, I don't necessarily believe this, though I would be open to persuasion. That an example of this in the American judicial system would be the overrepresentation of African Americans in the penitentiary system. So the overrepresentation, predominantly, vastly overrepresentation of African Americans in the penitentiary system, the argument could be that that representation is just. That representation represents the violence and the antisocial behavior of large segments of the African American community, and there is a system of control in place to protect the population from that antisocial behavior, be it drugs, violence, rape, murder, gang warfare, what have you. Again, I am, as perverse as it sounds, I am open to that line of reasoning. Well, let's see if it is the case. I'm more inclined, however, to believe that no, because of incarceration rates with respect to drug offenses, well, I mean, if you have a policy in place that incarcerates the distribution of crack cocaine and the punishment is significantly more severe than the incarceration rates for equal amounts in terms of quantity of exactly the same substance of powdered cocaine, well, now I can see why overrepresentation might occur. So the idea is not that it's not the case that it's impossible to think of an objective criteria in which the overrepresentation of African Americans in the American penitentiary system could be legitimized. Theoretically, it could be done. It's going to be impossible, if not hard, to make that justification, given the fact that the institutions of control and power in place to control sort of inter or even intra-ethnical violence and antisocial behavior unfairly, demonstrably, unfairly incarcerates individual members of a represented ethnical community at disproportionate levels for exactly the same offense. Very technical bit, but we've been into this lecture series now for a while, and this particular section for 2 hours. The idea is, or approaching 2 hours, and the idea is there's something amiss here, right? There's something amiss here, and the fact that the African American community isn't in a perpetual uproar about this is also something amiss. It also lends credence to the lingering power of colonized thought. If there isn't a back door, I'll create one for myself. The person who says that, the marginalized member of the community who says that, doesn't think that it's true of him or herself. She doesn't believe that he or she creates a back door for him or herself. They don't believe that. No, don't you see what you're doing? No, that's not what I'm doing. But the point of the fact is, specifically now in terms of institutions of control that overrepresent African American incarceration rates within the United States, given also the fact that it has been demonstrably proven that maybe not a significant or substantial, but many instances, I haven't done the statistics yet, countless instances of incarceration of equal offenses. The time doled out has been rather arbitrary and rather severe for African American offenders. Well, that creates a problem. So the power structure is in place to facilitate ethnical antagonism. Right? If it's the case that blacks are fighting blacks and blacks are fighting Hispanics and blacks are fighting Asians and Asians are fighting Asians and Asians are fighting Hispanics, if everybody's fighting everybody, you do need control. Because I definitely don't want to live in a state where the government can't control the population. So the idea is, and this is, I'm not necessarily adding anything that hasn't been thought of or been said before. This has been said. It's pretty deep for a sort of public lecture to sort of assess it in this means, but it's nothing revolutionary. The point is, interethnical violence facilitates and legitimizes political governance. If there were no interethnical violence, if that were to be eradicated tomorrow, which I actually also, on a side note, don't believe would even be possible, but let's just say conceptually that interethnic violence were to be eradicated tomorrow, it would weaken the need for political governance. It would weaken the need for, the social need for a judiciary and huge penitentiary systems. Now, to say that the government's in place to exacerbate the interethnical conflict and strategically, we know that in certain cases this has been true, right? But to say that that's a need presupposes that it wouldn't exist without interference, right? It presupposes that independent to any external interference, people would just be kumbaya, and there wouldn't be any interethnical conflict, and the only interethnical conflict that exists is a condition of some sort of conspiratorial government designed to facilitate aggression and antagonism against the races is too far of a stretch. No, independent to any interference, there would still be interethnical conflict, and the existence of that interethnical conflict would necessitate and legitimize political power. That political power is going to be in place to mitigate that conflict. The point is, no, could it be the case that conspiratorially there's interference? Sure, there could be. Does there need to be? Not necessarily, right? Because, me personally, I don't believe that independent to interference, there would be peace on earth. I don't believe that. I don't. I wish it were true, but it's not. Okay, so in, I gotta sneeze. Excuse me. In 4C, the role of strikebreakers in northern industrialists to stop strikes for low wages or low wage labor is an example of the split labor market theory, right? It's an operationalization. And the way that this works in terms of strikebreakers, you can imagine, this is a very relatively simple concept. I can draw it. You have the industry, and then you have its employees, and the employees, are represented, let's say, by a union, and the employees demand increase wages, which is going to decrease profits, and the employer, the industry, recognizes that to satisfy the demands of the unionized labor is going to increase their income but decrease profits. So what do? They hire strikebreakers. And these strikebreakers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, these strikebreakers, sort of a proportional amount, will work for less money. Not just less money than the demands, but less money than the existing money that's being spent on the labor pool. So, well, guess what? I'm going to hire a ton of strikebreakers, and they will replace your functionality for less money than I was paying you even prior to your demand. So your demand is to increase your existing money, your existing salary, and my strikebreakers will work for less than I'm actually paying you right now. These strikebreakers were historically ethnically identified. Right? These strikebreakers were ethnically identified. You can imagine that the decision to hire strikebreakers that are ethnically identified is going to increase the hostility between groups. Those Mexicans, those blacks, those Chinese. It's primarily been throughout history, not really so much blacks. For whatever reasons, we've been so marginalized that we've never really been competitors, even seen as competitors. Chinese in the Jason, what's it called? When you leave, you are frontiers. The frontier, conquering the West. Sort of, I forget the name of it. Frontiersmanship, whatever. When the American colonists were moving westward, Chinese laborers could be used in this sense, right? Chinese laborers were cheap laborers. And in a contemporary sense, and I hear this all too often, Mexican laborers. So primarily in the U.S. context, not so much blacks because we were just slaves, but Chinese and Mexicans were the threat. We identify the other as Chinese Americans and Mexican Americans as a threat. They're taking our jobs. But really and truly, you can see that the threat isn't really the population, because these people are already destitute. Right? This really isn't where the red line should go. This is what the authors argue. Whether I believe this or not doesn't really matter. I'm just giving you an account of what the system says. And the real threat isn't that. The real threat is this. The real threat is this. But that's not what we see. We can't see that. We can't see that it was the demand for increased compensation that resulted in the need for decreased expenditure so that we can increase profit. Right? So then you would use probably a Weberian, maybe Marxist critique of labor in order to really see the inherent boogeyman that's really operationally functional. It's obviously invisible. But the scapegoat becomes the strikebreakers, so that the strikebreakers become a means with which power establishes and preserves power by shifting focus to the ethnical class rather than the operationally functional need, quote unquote. But I mean, assuming a capitalist market economy, it is a legitimate need. The capitalists need to preserve at worst and maximize as an ethical obligation profits, right? Because there are aspects to capitalism that require as an ethic the maximization of capital, right? But I'm not going to get into that bit. So you can, I mean, that should be uber clear now. So that's the role of the strike breakers, right? So the first bit, this is 4C1 or 4CI. Low-wage laborers historically incentivize violence. Low-wage laborers historically incentivize violence, and we can see why now the strike breakers would incentivize violence, because your labor has been displaced. Forget, well, no, I guess I shouldn't talk in that sense. It's too Marxist. It's too deep. It's true, but you lost your job. It's not so much about your labor being displaced, which is what's operationally true, but people don't see it that way. People see it as, I lost my job, right? I lost my job. I don't have money. The truth of the matter is, behind that, it's not that, I mean, you did lose your job. You don't have money, but your labor has been displaced. You could conceivably get that back relatively easily, but you can't get it back at the wages and the demands that you previously had. That's foregone. That will never return. Capital won't allow it to return. But you can't tell people that because it's too discouraging. The truth of the matter is that the labor itself has been displaced. And the only way in which you're going to compete, there's only two ways, and this is an absolute fact. Increased specialization, which requires extensive training, extensive knowledge, or, and this is it, a willingness to work for less, do more for less, and that's the mantra of everything, even academia, do more for less. Fortunately for me, my lifestyle is do more for less, so they could never use that against me because I'm doing more for nothing. I've impoverished myself, not in terms of economically, but in terms of any number of other things. So, historically, it increases violence, right? So, low-wage labor historically incentivizes violence against those willing to work for lower wages. The point being, the much deeper point, is that it really is, the violence is a consequence of the displacement of their labor. It's not about a check. It's about the displacement of their labor. They could easily get back their jobs if they were willing to resume more for less. If you refuse to resume more for less, you're going to remain out of consideration in terms of the labor market, the only alternative being education. Education then would lead to increased specialization, and then maybe you can work on the machinery inside the building and get more, and your job would be secure as a consequence of just the difficulty of it all. Quick side note, no, it's actually not tangential. I have a moral obligation, I think, to do this as an academic. Code. teach your kids to write code. Learn to write code yourself. If you're having a hard time, if you're scared about the prospects of the future, if you feel like you're doing graduate education and you might not get a job, in your spare time, pick up a coding book and just learn some code. Go to coding sources and learn how to do it, because you can believe that the greatest vehicle, Zuckerberg is a testament to this, and the Twitter guys and the freaking Tumblr dudes are testament. Very, very young people making billions of dollars in a extremely short amount of time, all contingent on coding. There's going to be enormous need for coders in the future. Trust me on this. I'm giving you a gem right now, viewer. Learn some code, right? Learn a little code. It can't be that hard, you know? Just learn a little code, take your time, do your studies, but while you're studying for your exams and while you're doing all this other stuff, pick up a coding book and just learn some stuff. You know, mooch off a friend who understands it and, you know, do what you got to do to learn it. Why? Because you keep yourself in a position, in a viable position to be employed, right? You have to recognize, it seems tangential, but it's not. You have to recognize that the labor market is changing. There's going to be a huge, trust me on this, I know what I'm talking about, right? The labor market is changing, and the need for the 21st century workforce won't be like any other time in history. And those people who get the best jobs will be those, and those people who are able to secure their future for themselves and for their family will be those people who know how to write and read and translate and create code. So, not telling you to give up on academia and dreams to be sort of what I am and to do what I do, but it will increasingly be more and more difficult to do anything other than that. This will take decades, obviously. But the sooner you get the memo and work on increasing your specialization, when and if this does occur in your neck of the woods, you will immediately be able to say, well, don't forget me, I have specialization. I've recognized now that my labor has been displaced externally or internally, but meaning via neoliberal economic market conditions, or internally by, you know, strike breakers, if you will, but not strike breakers in terms of unionization, you know, American citizens who are willing to do the job for less. However, don't forget me, because I got something that you need. I can specialize. I can write the code that you guys need. Hey, no problem. Come back in. Let me talk to you. You know, I've been waiting for... So that's just my conscience. Can't say I didn't try to do any good. I'm trying to give you a heads up. You can take my word or not. So this increases horizontal violence. This concept comes from Paulo Freire. Horizontal violence is intra-ethnic violence, is really what it is, right? So black on black, Hispanic on Hispanic. So horizontal violence. It could be, another aspect of horizontal violence could be because the heterodox community, the oppressed community, is constituent within the United States, and I hate the word oppressed community, I don't actually like that. I would say the marginalized community. I don't like sort of the tone of the oppressed, especially in the context of the U.S. But the marginalized communities, absolutely, within the United States. Black, Hispanic, so black on Hispanic would be horizontal. Another way of looking at it more specifically, though Freire himself doesn't make this nuanced distinction, would be intra-ethnical. Hispanic on Hispanic, black on black constitutes sort of horizontal violence. Subordinated versus privileged minority groups. The idea, as I said earlier, several hours ago, the idea of a privileged minority group also has its disadvantages. So in the United States of America, you might say that even more than Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans are sort of the chosen minority group, right? If you look at Asian Americans, yeah, they have stereotypes, and I'm not in any sense saying that this is all peaches and cream, but there is a sense in which even the dominant ethnical group, whites, they cower, in a sense, collectively, not individually, cower to Asian intellect. So, oh, the Asians are competing, and I'll talk about this later in another series. You know, the Asians are the smart ones, and they get all the high-tech jobs, and they get all the pharmaceutical jobs, and the academic positions, and they're good with money, and they're good with this and that, and they mobilize upward quickly, and they're who we're competing against, despite the fact that they're such a minority. They're who we are competing against. Why? Because as we saw, political power and the ability to control is absolutely not contingent on representative population density. That was absolutely disproven. So if it's the case that the dominant ethnical group is consistently referring to competition from a specific minority group, though blacks are there and Hispanics are considered, and this is sort of gross to say this, but it's true, Hispanics are considered economically. They're considered because there's an ability to mobilize that capital, and that capital is what we want. There's an ability to mobilize, especially politically. You know, I'm surprised I haven't heard more of this, but sort of catering to the Hispanic community, for good or for bad, will incentivize enormous swaths of the electorate, the constituents, and everybody wants those votes. So if Republicans aren't catering to them, then, as we saw in the last election, it's a wrap. The Democrats will sweep in overwhelming numbers what has historically been sort of a given for Republicans. So, Republicans, oh yeah, I get the idea now, I better stop playing around, let's address the needs of the Hispanic community, let's talk about immigration, let's talk about what have you, da-da-da, pathway to citizenship, da-da-da, so that we don't lose that enormous voter block. It's different with Asian Americans, however, because Asian Americans, the community's too small to compete with Hispanic money. The community's too small to compete with sort of the history of black Americans. So the Asian American community could only ever be competing for one thing and one thing only, which is control and power. And that's when you hear the discourse is always best at competition, Ivy League elite graduation, masters of industry, masters of intellect. And those are the characteristics that establish all political power. All political power flows through, the totality of it flows through industry, education, and sort of invisible social systems of control and such. It's judiciary. And you hear this discourse all the time. So that the idea is, in terms of the privileged minority group, the privileged minority group is such because, I hate to say this because it sounds really, really pejorative, but this is the nature of the argument, you keep your enemies really close to you, right? If you think for 1 second that anyone in we assume sort of ethnical power as inherently tied to political power, which isn't really the case in the United States, which isn't really in any sense the case in the United States, but just as an example, white majority definitely still is the case. Actually, I take that back. I concede that point. No, it is the case in the United States. I just don't think it's as overt. It wouldn't be fair for me it'd be too much pandering to say that it isn't the case. It is the case. It's operationally true. It's just not obvious. So, since I don't have access to the truth, you know, I can only make speculations. But the idea is, Asian Americans are vying for, if you want to demonize the community, they're vying for the real power, right? The real power, which is the power to control. And thus, well, let's pander to that community. Let me appease that community so that that potential threat doesn't manifest itself in the ultimate desire for control, right? So that's that. So the next is 21st century reincarnation, imported versus exported labor. This, in terms of the split market, without getting into too much detail, the old, quote-unquote, old model was one of colonization. We went out. We cultivated the land. We, the people, whoever the colonizers were, left the colony, left home, and colonized some sort of foreign, savage land. That's the old model. What happened after that was neoliberal sort of economics. And you know, as the years change, your mind changes, your exposure, my level of idealism has changed. I'm far more realistic. to better or worse. When I first started studying this, I held a position that I don't personally hold now. I'm not going to reveal what that position is, but my position has changed in years, and it might change again. But in terms of neoliberal economics, you know, as I got older and I read more, I started to realize, no, capital isn't nationally affiliated. Capital isn't interested. First of all, capital doesn't exist as a thing. Capital is an ideology. It's so rigorous and so logical and so deductively sound an ideology that you can't control it politically. You can't control it with anything. It is going to make determinations where it can maximize profit. So what is best? There's too much money. Look, the British Empire collapsed because of expenditure, because of perpetual war. Why would I do that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to outsource. So I outsource labor. So the call centers left, and people, this is how India got enormous, right? Call centers leave. You train. British colonization ushered, unbeknownst to Britain, American power. Because this sounds really vulgar, but it's true. The Brits taught Indians, people who lived in the colonized India, how to speak English. Right? English became dominant. So lots of people in Britain, in the former colony, learned to speak English. That ended up becoming an advantage for America with the collapse of the British Empire. The collapse of the British Empire was a consequence of the overinvestment in perpetual warfare. What does America do? We recognize this. Not we, some magic boogeyman behind the scenes. No. Global capital realized this. Holy crap. You mean I'm paying call center workers in the United States $14, $15, $20 an hour to answer phone calls? And giving them benefits when there are people who speak exactly the same language in India that will do it for a third of that money? And profits grew and profits grew. You think your competitor is going to watch your profits grow and not do the same thing? Then it wasn't just, sort of service-based. Then it was product-based. Then it was textiles. Then it was everything's leaving the U.S. Everything's going abroad. Oh my goodness, what happens to the workforce here? You think it's some conspiracy? No, it's not. It's global capitalism being what it is. If people would have understood that in the 80s, that this is the trend and this is what's going to happen, they would have adjusted. When I tell you, graduate students, in your free time, I'm sort of young to be sort of lecturing, but I am lecturing, that it would behoove you to learn some coding. It would behoove you to learn some coding, right? So the idea is that's the trend. The new trend now is, well, no, I can make money at home. I don't have to leave. I can bring money to me. The only way that that's going to be accomplished, however, is via the internet. Because the internet makes geography irrelevant. You just need internet access. And as long as you have access anywhere in the globe to this medium, I can make money at home. I don't have to leave. And you better believe that that's the new paradigm. But that paradigm is going to be built on a new model, and that new model is going to require a new labor force, and that new labor force is going to have to know how to code. Thus, if you don't know how to code, you better specialize in something else, and you better be really, really good. So, don't say I didn't call it, but it's here, it'll be uploaded in cyberspace, people will be able to look back and be like, he called it, right? So, and I'm absolutely certain of this. So 4D, oh my goodness, this is taking so long. Competition involves more than two antagonistic ethnic groups. It also involves third parties who wield power and who wish to maximize profits by stimulating competition between ethnic groups in the labor market, right? Now, again, I agree with the author. This is a direct quote, obviously. This is historically true. I don't have hope or faith. I can infer that things will get better because there isn't the need for sort of textile, industrialist, old world market economy. We are not an industrialist market economy anymore at all. I wouldn't even say we're so much globalized. I mean, globalization probably is the end all, but we aren't even so much globalized anymore. Now we're getting niche specific within globalized market economy. We are an emerging this type, right? So that the idea is the old world model of sort of strike breaking and the bad Asians and the bad minority Mexicans, while that might work a little bit, and it has worked a little bit, it's far more complex now. And while I do agree with the author, this context is a bit outdated. The new competition is ethnical. Yes, it is. It's ethnical, but it's really national. And that's the real transition. It's no longer inter-ethnical competition. It's national competition. And what will end up happening is that we are, quote-unquote, using an Indian labor pool or a Brazilian labor pool or an Argentinian labor pool to facilitate services and needs, product needs. It's either products or services, to facilitate service needs or product needs of U.S. consumption, of quote-unquote first world consumption, wherever they may be. And that need for consumption, which is always going to be there, is going to create huge, huge investment, capital investment into other nations. The idea is balancing game. How much investment do we want to make? They're saying the same thing about us. How much investment do we want to make? Because if we make too much investment, we bolster their nation, not the ethnicity. We bolster their nation. And too much economic support of the nation might compromise our national interests, might even compromise our national security interests. So we have to start consolidating and working together and working within groups that, this is our in-group and that's the out-group. It's not that we don't do business with you guys, but we do business more with this group. Why? Because this group can generate the most profit for us and protect our national interests the best. You had better believe that this is the trend. This is absolutely, unequivocally, undeniably the trend. The idea isn't if it's good or bad. I really don't believe it's bad. I think it's a condition of global capitalism. The idea is, how do I put myself in a position to be on the vanguard? How do you put yourself in a position to be at the very edge? I'm doing it right now by talking to you wherever you are in the globe. If you don't live in the United States and you're listening right now to the words that are coming out of my mouth to cite Chris Tucker, then I'm doing my part because I've exported my product. Granted, I'm not making any money off of this, but I've exported my product. This is a template. It's very effective. And were I to interact with you guys, and I do interact with some of you that email me, blah, 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 and, I'm always open to do collaboration and, make the world a better place. I really believe in that sort of stuff. There's tons of opportunities for me. There's infinite opportunities for me because I've given so much. So people who are interested in collaborating, we collaborate. People who are interested in, just shooting the philosophical BS, we shoot this philosophical BS. Yeah, I can't tell you how many students have said, hey, Dr. Campbell, great, you helped me through my exams and blah, blah, blah. That's what this is for. So that the idea is you have to figure out what your niche is, and you need to adopt a healthy appreciation and understanding of what this next economic wave is going to be, and rather than chide it and castigate it and bemoan it, operationalize it for your betterment. If you're in the business of making money, make some money. If you're in the business of doing what I'm doing, spreading free education, then go all in, right? Because this is, I don't have to say what I've done. You're watching my contribution, right? So, 2 more points. Split class. This is the longest section lecture in all of history. Split class theories. Class theories emphasize economic exploitation of the lower classes by those of the higher classes. And this is sort of the basic Marxist account. I'm not going to go into the Marxist account because there's far too many Marxists in the world, but the truth of the matter is there's so few Marxists in the world. There's a few people who really get Marx, and there's a whole lot of people who parrot Marx. And I just, Marx is like, nails on a chalkboard. After a while, it's like I only want to hear my Marx from a few people. The rest, I'd rather not listen to a lot of the Marxist discourse because it's been so regurgitated. Shout out to all the graduate students of the world, but understand Marx, but move on. Let's do something new because it's dated. It's dated, right? And the idea of an ultimate liberation theory is I don't know how many times historically it's been proven false. I do genocide studies, I can't tell you how many genocidal regimes adopted a Marxist sentiment. So I am exposing my bias as such, and some scholars will disagree with me. Fine, it's not a problem. But we need to, understand Marx, have an appreciation of Marx, recognize that Marx really has made an operational discourse, but also recognize that society has changed. Recognize that our commodification is virtual. Recognize that he could not have contemplated that phenomenon, and thus capital is bigger than he could have ever conceptualized. Capital has morphed into this new thing, and we need new theorists. And I'm going to jump on this bandwagon in a couple of years, but we need new theorists to think about virtual commodification. We need new theorists to think about virtual services, virtual products. Right? We need new theorists to come up with ways that the system can be more reciprocal in the diversification of opportunity, in educational accessibility, in the potential, almost bizarre, argument for a right to internet accessibility. Right? Is it actually a universal human right now that we've developed this technology to have internet access? Should it be Wi-Fi? Do we have to have Wi-Fi? What nature of cloud-based system is important for the flourishing of a community, for the economic development of the nation, for national identity? I mean, we need people to be talking about that stuff, not Marx. We've done Marx. We've done it, okay? Let's move on, please. Please. I've had my fill. I've had my fill of Marx. I love him. The guy's amazing, but goodness gracious, let's move on. Right? We need people to start doing some 21st century stuff. I'm doing my 21st century bit. You know what I'm saying? All right, moving on. Last bit. Sorry for the breakdown. Middleman minority theories. Right? This is the last bit. It's pretty important, right? It's sort of exhausting, all of this lecturing. But middleman, it's for the good. It's for the good. Middleman minority theories. A go-between. There's a betweeners. I think it's called go-betweeners. Betweeners. This is awesome. The In-Betweeners. It's this awesome series. I watched it. I wish they had more of it. It's a British series. This has nothing to do with any of this. My mind just went there. The In-Betweeners was a British series about sort of teenage, adolescent boys and girls in British school system and the problems that they have. It's on Netflix. So if you want something to veg out, I think I'm thinking about vegging out after this. Watch it. It's a great series. Has nothing to do with this. Go-betweens accommodate the economic accessibility to ethnical subpopulations and those who own the means of production. Now, the idea is old model. We go to colonize. We need people who have our back. I'm keeping it really funky. What we're going to do is we're going to co-opt the ruling elite. We're going to co-opt the intelligentsia. Intelligentsia automatically becomes a PR propaganda machine to facilitate sort of this colonized mentality, this adoration for the colonizer and all things colonial, and obviously the leaders of industry and the actual social leaders are going to be in place to secure our economic advantage. In terms of that, we incentivize inter-ethnical competition by selecting a privileged ethnical group to reap the benefits of the most marginalized population's exploitation. So that's a mouthful. What in the world does that mean? So let me give you an example. So this is 6b. For example, tensions have emerged between African American residents. This is intrastate. Tensions have emerged between African American residents and Korean business owners. This is prior to the LA riots in the ghetto areas, as demonstrated by attacks in businesses during the LA riots. Korean business owners, as the go-betweeners, afforded economic accessibility to the ghetto. So what ends up happening is that we have a marginalized community Right? We have the ghetto community, and we recognize that there's tons of money in the ghetto community. There's tons of money to be made. So what we do is we recognize the ghetto community is represented by blacks. And let's just say, this is stereotypical as hell, but let's just say that those who own the means of production, the bigwigs, are all whites. Instead of having blacks serve themselves in the population, so blacks open up shops, black-owned shops, and we saw these pictures, right? So it's like, I own a shoe shop, you own a shirt shop, you own the bakery, you own the cinema, and that money cycles, that black, quote-unquote, black money, cycles throughout the black community, what we do is we elect Asians. And part of the labor market is reserved for Asians to establish their businesses in the black community. So blacks give their money to Asians, and Asians benefit. And they become a middle-class strata, a really thick middle-class strata. Part of the reason, part of the animosity, and part of the problem for Asian community members has been, Asian Americans that is that there's resentment in the black community for their success, and their success is contingent on the allocation of tons and tons, and not allocation, the expenditure of tons and tons of black dollars, if you will, black dollars, and they establish the middle class means by which then they, the Asians, now compete intellectually with Caucasians. And this is precisely why the next mode of tension would be making sure that, in a conspiratorial sense, making sure that Asian Americans stay in their place, if you will, and not compete for the real power. Why? Because we recognize control, as I said earlier, control of power is not contingent on the population density of the represented group. Anybody can be in control of power. It doesn't matter how big or how small the population is, power isn't contingent on numbers. That's the lie. That's the lie that I'm so upset with people who say, well, Jason, your stuff is good, but you're just too abstract and not enough historical citations. I'm not a historian. I wasn't trained to be a historian. But that's a side note. So this group, the Asians, then become the go-between. So part of the riot, I mean, the riots really had something to do with Rodney King. People were definitely upset. But what ended up happening was the riot was more informed by this blaring disparity between the absolute non-representation, none of the, or few, if any, and I probably might even say none, but very insignificant portions of the minority, and this is the point, right, the middleman minorities, as a minority group, as the middleman minorities resided in the ghetto. No, they lived in semi-affluent, middle class, or maybe even high middle class, upper middle class communities. But it's not fair. So the first opportunity to release all of this rage was to destroy their means of sustenance, was to destroy their means of economic advantage, and thus to destroy their upward mobilization. Right? So it was an attempt to destroy their upward mobilization, because their upward mobilization is pretty much entrenched in that reserved middleman minority status, right? And that is key, right? Upward mobilization is inherent in the reservation of that group, middleman, sort of minority status. But it's something, actually, if you think about it, it's something far more sinister, far deeper than just that, even though that is not surface level. What we need to realize with respect to the middleman minority groups and the quote-unquote go-betweeners is that in terms of the economy, in terms of the structures for the procurement, the economy is a structure for the procurement of increased capital. That's what the economy is. It's the system in place to generate capital is the economy. The economy is itself, it exists independent to any of these racial demarcations. It doesn't care who you put in that place. You could put anybody in that place. It could be any minority that could be in that. It could be Hispanics, it could be Asians, it could be blacks. And that's the point. It could be blacks. It could be anybody, because the market itself doesn't care. The fact that it's not blacks, the fact that blacks aren't represented as economically viable contributors to their own community means that there's something operational in addition to capital. And that is one thing and one thing only. It's white supremacy, obviously. It can't be anything else. Because market economics don't care about color. Anybody can facilitate this need. There's going to be a need for this. Why couldn't it be just blacks? Well, it's not going to be blacks. Well, it's not going to be blacks, Jason, because they wouldn't be in between then. Well, that's the point. The in-between itself is creating a condition that is something additional to capital itself. Now, the example is, a contemporary example I read a few years back had to do with sort of hair care in the black community. Huge thing, a $1 billion industry. Weave and hair stuff and, you know, any type of hair stuff. And there's actually, and graduate students who are interested in this, go pull up the data, go Google this, find the articles, write some papers. Yeah, there were extreme policy-based measures which were implemented to certify and make sure that the certifications were in place and that the codes were met and the orders were in place and all the bureaucratic paperwork was needed, and all these loops and hoops that had to be jumped through so that you could continue to, blacks could continue to preserve profits, and it excluded vast portions of the black community who had constructed and built and established this business, and most of that has been relinquished now, again, to Asian Americans. So that the entrepreneurial aspects of capital, and entrepreneurship is the engine of capital. Without entrepreneurship, this comes to an end. Without entrepreneurship, capital is over, because you can't just keep on selling and reproducing the same crap. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is always about what's new and what's latest. What's the new niche? And when you think that we've diversified enough, you better believe there's another 200 generations worth of incarnation of capital. You better believe it. I am absolutely not Marxist in that sense. I don't believe in the end of it. There's always some new thing to create. There's always some new thing to sell. The idea is, however, why are we still denying the entrepreneurship and the possibilities that will fortify and bolster capitalist market economy if it can be generated within the black community and preserved within the black community? Let's have at it. If no, then, and only then, would I say that there really does need to be more academic research into very, very latent, operationally functional, white supremacist, anti-every minority, including blacks. It's still very functional. But that would compromise, in the end, capital. It will. It will. So Marx is potentially right. We'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see if there's going to be a demise to capital. If there is going to be an end to capital, it won't because of war. It won't because of exploitation. It won't. It's going to be because of an unwillingness to allow capital to be what it is. Capital doesn't see race. Capital doesn't see sexuality. Capital doesn't care about your religion. Capital doesn't care. What capital wants to do is expand capital. Does it exploit? Absolutely it exploits. I recognize that. Does it also benefit? It also benefits. Right? It's not just exploitative. And it's not also just beneficial. But the idea is, if entrepreneurship is being stifled within an ethnical community where entrepreneurship could diversify and increase niche market economies within diverse communities, and it's not allowed to flourish because there's, that flourishing has been reserved for the middleman minority groups, you have to recognize that there will eventually be a challenge for ultimate power. There has to be. There's only one way to go. You're not going down. You only can go up. So there's eventually going to be, and I'm not trying to be, I don't want this to be seedy, in a sense. I'm not trying to be antagonistic or sort of aggravating, but you have to believe it. It's secured, stabilized, middle-class structure as a consequence of allowing for the economic accessibility to impoverished communities of any kind necessitates the empowerment of that middle-class strata with the prospects of potential control. Now, that's just what it is. That's just what it is. So again, not trying to be seedy, not trying to, you know, plant any boogeyman conspiracy theories or any of that, but we recognize, I mean, this is profoundly complicated. It's now that I'm doing this lecture, I'm starting to realize how freaking just phenomenally intricate all of this is. And I could probably even go deeper, but I'm not, because I'm exhausted and I've been lecturing forever. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm done. Thanks for watching my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Goodbye.